right. Good evening, everyone. We're going to continue to admit folks, but we want to uh, appreciate everyone's time this evening. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Susan White, one of the board members from the Reading League Maryland. We're so glad that you are sharing your evening with us. We want to give you an overview of our plan for this evening. The chat is open to connect with other participants. You may submit your questions for Dr. Graham via the chat, and we will monitor those. And then at the conclusion of our presentation, we will have a brief Q&A. We are recording this event, so you can turn off your video if you do not want to have your face recorded. Closed captions are available as well. A word from our sponsors, Key to Literacy, is going to be sharing some information with us shortly, and then they will follow up with an introduction to Dr. Graham. All right, thanks again, everyone, for being here, and at the end, we'll share some of our contact information. We'd love to connect with you for future events. Shauna?
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Shauna Cotty here from Keys to Literacy. I'm honored to be part of the Reading League Maryland event tonight. And Keys to Literacy is proud to sponsor the work going on for Reading League Maryland and to be teeing things up for Dr. Stephen Graham tonight. At Keys to Literacy, we offer comprehensive literacy solutions from PK to grade 12. And we do everything from literacy audits to leadership coaching to job embedded coaching for educators. And we offer a wide variety of professional learning in all things literacy, comprehension, vocabulary, reading, and we stretch up to higher ed partnerships. And one thing that I would like to highlight here tonight, since the topic is writing, is that we offer professional learning services in lots of flexible options related to writing instruction. Our founder, Joan Sedita, has recently published The Writing Rope. So some of you may have seen this book related to the framework on explicit instruction related to writing. But in addition to speaking events and things that we do around the Writing Rope, we offer practical professional learning for educators around early writing and around upper grade writing. And these are really just research-based strategies that can be applied in any content area, any grade level. A lot of our stuff really leans on Dr. Graham's research and how do we bridge that over to practice and make things practical for teachers. So I would invite you to visit us, and in this next slide, you'll see our website, which is just keystoliteracy.com. And if you want to get in touch with Jackie Hale, who is a relationship manager for us at Keys to Literacy, Jackie's contact is there for you all. And we would love to hear from you. How can we maybe help you out with writing, or sign up for our blog or any of our upcoming events? And we would love to be connected to those of you in Maryland. I'm excited tonight to introduce Dr. Stephen Graham. Steve Graham is a Regents and Warner Professor in the Division of Leadership and Innovation in Teachers College at Arizona State University. For 47 years, he has studied how writing develops, how to teach writing effectively, and how writing can be used to support reading and learning. His research involves typically developing writers as well as students with special needs in both the elementary and the secondary settings, with much of it occurring in classrooms in urban schools. Graham is the former editor, I should say, of Exceptional Children, Contemporary Educational Psychology, Journal of Writing Research, Focus on Exceptional Children, and Journal of Educational Psychology. He is the co-author of the Handbook of Writing Research, Handbook of Learning Disabilities, the APA Handbook of Educational Psychology, Writing Better, Powerful Writing Strategies for All Students, and Making the Writing Process Work. It is also worth noting he is the author of 3 influential Carnegie Corporation reports, Writing Next, Writing to Read, and Informing Writing. And I will just add that his work has been foundational to the Keys to Literacy professional offerings for teachers, and he has been quite a North Star for all things writing that we lean on at Keys to Literacy. We've appreciated his partnership over the years, and it is an honor to introduce Steve Graham to all of you.
Thank you very much. That was a very nice introduction. Sometimes you don't know who they're really talking about when you get introduced in these things, but I very much appreciate it. It's gonna take just a second to get this slideshow where I actually want it. Okay, so whoops, no, I thought I was good to go. I'm not. So hmm. So is the slideshow up? Can you let me know that?
We see the regular PowerPoint, not in slideshow mode.
Yeah, for some reason it's not going into this. Well, let's try from current slide. For whatever reason, while it was working before,
On
it
a
doesn't seem to
separate
want to work
screen.
now.
There was a pop-up button that said resume slideshow right there. Yes. I wonder if that would work for you.
Okay, let's try that. Um, no, not quite. Give me, not going to do this forever. We'll just end up going with what we have here. I think it's probably visible. Is that correct to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. So I'd like to start by actually talking about my connections to Maryland. My wife and I and our daughter lived for 23 years in the Maryland, DC area. Karen and I worked at University of Maryland until 2012. And so I'm quite familiar with Maryland. I've always loved the state and the university. How can you go wrong? You've got the Chesapeake Bay, the ocean's close by, the mountains are very close. You've got Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and, in the distance a little bit, Philadelphia and New York. So it's always good to do something at a place that you consider your home. Um, I'm going to give one more shot at this slideshow thing. I'm kidding. Yeah, it's not going to work. Okay, so,
Try clicking on the slide and then launch it.
okay. Let me try it one more time. Let me go back to the first slide. No, I'm not sure what's going on there. I could take a second and go out. Let's do this. Let me go out of share for a second. I may need for you to share me back in, and let me just disappear for a second, and I'll bring this back up again and access it. At least I think I'll do that.
Hit stop share on your side.
It stopped share on my side. Okay. What I'm having a little trouble doing is figuring out how to get, let me try this.
If you have multiple monitors on your side, it might be on a second screen.
Yeah, what I'm trying to do is get completely, take myself out of this so I can actually get to PowerPoint and bring that down, but it doesn't, for whatever reason, don't, did that do, wait a minute. Okay, you can't see the slides now, can you?
It's still the same as what you had up before. It's still the same. So
Okay.
if you hit share screen and if it's on a different screen, just select the
Yeah,
screen.
so I've got the full thing up now on my side. Let's see if it
Hit
works.
share screen and it should
Does
give you
that do it?
options. Yeah, there it is. That's it.
Okay.
Perfect.
Sorry about that. So, I was going to try to multitask at the same time there and talk about Maryland and um, fiddle with this, but that wasn't working too well. So, what I was asked to talk about was the What Works Clearinghouse Elementary Writing Practice Guide. And uh, the federal government, through the Institute of Educational Science, um, funded the What Works Clearinghouse. And one of the things that they were charged with doing is develop practice guides that present recommendations for educators, and I would say beyond educators, for people who teach courses on literacy, for policymakers, et cetera, to address challenges in their classroom and schools. And basically, these practice guides, while meant to be practical, are based on reviews of research, but also, and particularly in the case of this guide here, which was the first one in writing, the experience of practitioners and experts' opinions um, of what was considered a nationally recognized panel of experts. Now, there'll be a couple of things I say about that. I think there are some strengths and some limitations to this, and I'll address the limitations in part a little bit later in terms of some meta-analysis we've done that will kind of give a little bit more breadth to what we know about what works in writing. But one of the advantages to this is that these guides are free. And, they've been, this has been going on for quite a while. Now, somewhat surprisingly, the federal government has kind of dipped their toes in what I would call making these more practical. They had a group that was a What Works group that was developing films of classrooms using practices like in this particular one, which I worked with them on. And just before they were finished, the Fed shut it down. So none of that kind of came to fruition. Also, in the last couple of years, this practice guide and the secondary one, which I'll talk about next week, um, uh, different organizations, research organizations, actually put these into play in schools and did research studies with them. I have no idea what has happened to that now that those grants were shut down and there's no dissemination for them anymore. So there has been an attempt by IES to make these more practical, to share on a broader basis, and I think it's unfortunate that that hasn't come to fruition, even though there were multiple attempts to do so. A second thing that's probably worth noting is that you can think of these research recommendations as being based on the best evidence available. And I'll say a little bit about that later, but these are really high quality studies. Now, whenever you kind of limit yourself down to the best evidence available, a lot of other evidence starts to disappear. And so that kind of restricts what you can say. And I'll take that on a little bit later, as I said. The other thing is that these practice guides cover a broad range of academic areas, and you can see some examples here, but they include things like math, reading, and behavior, and they're really a phenomenal source, for people to draw upon and not have to, spend money to take a look at them. I will also say that they have a lot of practical suggestions within the guides themselves, and I'll share a couple in each of the areas tonight. Um, this particular guide was updated, I think, in 2019 or somewhere around there. And the guide was put together. This is the people who worked on it, and this isn't including the Mathematica people. And Mathematica had the grant for this. Um, I ended up being the chair on this. It's probably because I had done a meta-analysis on writing instruction for the Carnegie Corporation called Writing Next, even though it was done with fourth to 12th grade. There hadn't been a meta-analysis since 1986 in writing that was done by a guy at University of Chicago. we had a mix of people in terms of who was on. Alicia Bollinger was a classroom teacher and very, very knowledgeable about writing. And I also want to highlight Catherine DeAust, who, even though it says University of California at Irvine, she worked with the National Writing Project there, which Carol Booth Olson, who also was at the University of California at Irvine at the time, headed. And both Catherine and Carol are two of the smartest people about writing I know in terms of practical things that work in the classroom. Both of them have extensive experience, and all three of the first three people after my name there brought their classroom experience to bear in this. Charles MacArthur lives in the Washington, D.C. area on the Maryland side. Uh, I worked with him for a number of years at University of Maryland, but he ended up moving eventually to University of Delaware, but still lives still lives in D.C. Deborah McCutcheon, who's retired now, is at the University of Washington and was an educational psychologist. And Natalie Olinghouse was a doctoral student when I was at Vanderbilt University, who focused in on writing assessment and is not in academia anymore, but really did some great stuff with looking at writing assessment and kind of how to monitor students' progress. So this is kind of the academic and the practical end of the people that participated. Um, I have to say that you have to really, when you look at these guides, you have to look at the organization that put these together, because I want to say a little bit about how they come together, and then we'll get into them. Um, you have MC Bradley, Virginia. I'm not exactly sure how to say her name correctly, so I'm not even going to try. Bryce Honoran and Cass Jewell. And a lot of the work, the actual kind of day-to-day work on these guides are done by the organization who gets the contract for them. And they basically start before you have all these experts come in and do their thing. They set the parameters for what's going to be looked at, like the grade levels, the type of research. And in this case, it was true experiments and quasi experiments that where there wasn't random assignment to conditions, but there was also a lot of other parameters that, in terms of the What Works Clearinghouse guide for the studies that would meet criteria that were very strict. So, really high quality research, very little attrition in them, very careful in terms of the students in the different conditions being equivalent at pretest, et cetera. Once, everybody was on board, then they brought us together to DC, and that started, kind of the what we did in this. And the first part was to do a systematic search of the literature. Now, it's important to realize that from one of these practice guides to the next, these searches are going to differ. They search for a set number of years. And in the case of this, I drove them crazy because we had just looked at something like 29,000 abstracts at the elementary level for a meta-analysis we were doing. And I think I gave them something like, in addition to the search that they did for 10 years, something like another 5,000 papers to pull and look at. So I think we probably did as comprehensive a job as we could in terms of identifying what was there. The next step, and this really isn't something that the experts did, there was a system for evaluating the suitability of each study. And basically what they would do is they'd establish or identify experts with certain skills, research skills out in the field, and pay them for coding these studies for their suitability and various factors. So that wasn't something that was done by our team. Now, we were very familiar with the studies that eventually came through. Remember, it's a much smaller set. When I say I gave, thousands of things to them, what you end up with is, a couple, much less than 100 studies on the whole thing. And then once these studies had been analyzed, effect sizes drawn, then what we did is we came back together a couple of times. looking at the data and working with Mathematica to draw implications for practice. Now, one thing I will say about this particular practice guide is that they allowed the team to make recommendations. And actually there's two recommendations we made here that are not based on solid research they would see as appropriate. So they allowed expert opinion to creep in there, which I actually think was a good thing, but I'm gonna backtrack on one of the recommendations in just a second. In the secondary one, which I'll talk about next week, that wasn't the case. And then the practice guide was written. What we did was, once we knew what the recommendations were, we gave them tons of examples of things that fit the recommendation. Their staff basically did the writing on that, and we did the revising and making sure things stayed stayed true to what we were trying to do. Now, I do want to say, and I think this is important to realize, you can think of these recommendations as general principles. So you'll look in the guides, and this is especially true for the secondary guide. There's a lot of practical examples given. If you said, were those actual practice examples tested? Not all of them were. They're examples of the principle. And so that's something that's important to keep in mind. The other thing that I would say is I always give a buyer beware stipulation. Just because something works in a research study doesn't mean it'll work in your individual. The situation and conditions are different. The kids are different. Research studies usually have more resources. Sometimes they're done with graduate assistants who are working with kids, and they don't have the same reality that teachers do when they're the ones delivering instruction, because there's all kinds of things, for all of you who work in schools, as I once did, know that get you off task. There's there's a trip, there's a fire alarm. It seems like every week there's something that takes you off task, if not once or multiple times. So I give the buyer beware suggestion up front. If you apply something that's based on a principle, monitor whether it works. And if it doesn't, then you may decide it's not appropriate for your class, or you may make some adjustments to make it more effective. So I've done my cautionary tale at this point. So let's take a look. One last thing before I go into this. I was also asked to indicate where my research in the WWC guide overlap, and any place that you see red, that will mean that there's a place that it overlaps and I'm likely to make a comment about as well. So the first recommendation that we made was that we need to provide time daily for students to write. And you'll see that that says minimal evidence. At the time, that was based primarily on expert opinion. Now, I am working on a large meta-analysis now, one we finished at the secondary level and one at the elementary level. And I have to tell you, the evidence that we have doesn't support this. And when I say it doesn't support this, what I'm saying is that if you just increase how much time you have students write, it won't hurt anybody, but it also probably will not push kids forward in terms of their writing capabilities. So a way to think about it, and the way I kind of approach it, is that writing is a necessary but not sufficient activity to help students become better writers. Now, I'm not in any stretch of the imagination suggesting that we not have kids write. And so maybe a way of thinking about this is, when I lived in Maryland, I played basketball about, I don't know, 4 or 5 times a week. And, to be quite honest, when I was in high school, I played on high school basketball team, and I didn't really like the practice that we had to do, that we'd go to during basketball season, but you would do it because you'd be better when you played in the game. But the real game was playing basketball. The preparation and the training was helping you do that. And if all you did was run drills, then you wouldn't play on the high school basketball team. You probably wouldn't play basketball at all. And I would say that's fairly similar in terms of writing. We want to think about it that way. I'd say the same thing with reading. Now, this is where kind of the red indication comes in. I'm going to just briefly share with you why I'm making the statement I am here. So we conducted a 2-year study with first grade and second grade kids, very large study in Norway that was published about a year ago. And Norway is a slightly different beast in terms of working with teachers there than it is in the US. Um, basically getting anything that's explicit in orientation in terms of instruction in play is quite difficult. And so what we did is we worked with teachers for those 2 years to design what would be functional writing activities, activities that served a purpose with an audience, but also that teachers thought their students would see as engaging. And I have to say, I think that generally was the case. And the teachers who delivered that instruction did that over a 2-year period of time. And we compared it with kids in first and second grade who were getting traditional instruction. Now, Norway, like much of the rest of the world, there's not a lot of writing instruction going on. Um, even at first and second grade. What we found out is that those 2 years, while the kids were very positive about writing, said they enjoyed it, we saw no growth in terms of the quality of their writing in comparison when we compared that to the students who just did things in a traditional way. Now, quite honestly, that's the kind of thing you hate to say because you don't want to waste anybody's time. And 2 years is a long period of time. But that was a very, very stringent test of this. Now, when I say that writing alone will not do it, I'll come back a little bit later and talk about writing as a tool for enhancing reading comprehension and writing as a tool for enhancing learning in science, social studies, and math. Now, those are writing activities and they do have an effect. So our basic contention, and I don't think this is met by many schools from an expert opinion, is that in the first 5, 6 grades, students, there needs to be an hour devoted to writing each day. At least 30 minutes of that needs to be spent writing and 30 minutes on instruction. I can tell you that, based on observational studies we've done, surveys that we've done nationally with random sample of teachers, maybe we're getting 40 minutes a day in first, second, and third grade. And that drops to 25 or 30 minutes when we're talking about fourth, fifth, and sixth grade. So this is an area I think that we could do a better job of. You'll see down below on this slide, it says integrate across the curriculum. One of the challenges that teachers constantly say when you say you need to increase the amount of time spent teaching writing or writing is we just don't have time. We have a very crowded curriculum. And so one of the ways to address that is to integrate writing as a tool for learning and understanding material read, throughout the day. That increases, how much students write, but it also puts writing in its proper perspective. In my opinion, that writing is a tool, and one of the things that it's particularly useful for is facilitating understanding and learning. The second recommendation that we made, and I want you to see this had strong evidence for it. So, and that is to teach students to use the writing process for a variety of purposes. And in terms of that recommendation, we had 3 sub-recommendations. We want to engage students in the writing process. And you'll notice it's in parentheses, it says flexible use. We don't want to have them being these robots we see here. So one of the things that sometimes happens when we set up a process, approach to writing or process-oriented writing in our classrooms is we always have kids plan, draft, revise, edit, and publish. And it's always that same sequence. And students don't learn to use that process in a flexible way. There are times that students don't need to plan. if you're doing like a quick write to see what they know about something, they don't need to plan. You just get them to write something quickly so that that serves as a conversation point for what they're going to be learning or what they know at this point. When we plan, we can revise plans. We can get feedback from peers to do that. But the point here is we need to be more flexible than we sometimes are with this. We also want to teach strategies for carrying out these processes of planning, drafting, revising, and editing. Now, quite frankly, writing takes place in the head. Kids can't see what's going on. And so, what they do see is the visual aspects of writing, like, where you're transcribing something on paper, but the thought processes are invisible to them unless we make those visible. And I'll talk a little bit about modeling in a second and strategies a little bit more. One of the criticisms of strategy instruction, and let's take a really simple strategy. Let's say that we were teaching something like brainstorming. So that's about as simple a strategy as you can get, and kids in kindergarten and first grade, can learn to brainstorm. Um, we want students, once they learn various strategies, say maybe a semantic web as well, or other things that are more genre specific, we want them to start thinking about the assignment they're working on and picking the kinds of strategies or strategic processes they want to put in play and do that in a flexible use. What we don't want to see is that we teach students a strategy in second grade and we see them again in fourth grade and they're using the same strategy. It is not, scaled up or become more complex. And so we've kind of trapped them in a box if that's the case. And we want to be sure that we teach students to write for multiple purposes. And, one of the important things here is that we have a real audience for writing as much as possible, too. And, basically in some ways with the advent of Common Core state standards, we've narrowed down what we focused our writing instruction on, with a stronger emphasis now on persuasion or argumentation or opinion writing, informative writing, and narrative writing. And one of the disadvantages to that is it used to be with young kids, pretty much all we did was narrative writing, stories and personal narratives. Now we're kind of flipped, and there's nothing wrong with persuasive writing or informative writing, but I think we've lost we've come a little imbalanced in the other direction on this as well. Now, to be more specific, you'll see self-regulated strategy development up here. So I'm going to spend a little time sharing with you what this is and what a strategy or actually a set of strategies would look like with second or third grade students. And some of these strategies can be geared upwards or downwards depending upon students' capabilities. Self-regulated strategy development was actually developed by my wife, Karen Harris, who I've worked with at every university I've been with. And the basic idea behind it is that students are taught task-specific strategies for accomplishing a particular kind of writing typically. So if we were looking at something like persuasive writing or opinion writing, they might be taught a task-specific strategy for that, but for planning, and maybe a strategy for drafting or for revising. But they're very specific strategies or heuristics that help you kind of organize the mental operations you need to engage in to be successful with that kind of task. The other thing that self-regulated strategy development does, which is different from most of the other strategy instructional approaches, is it places a strong emphasis on teaching kids self-regulation processes that they use in conjunction with the strategies, um, not only to regulate those strategies, but the writing process and, depending upon the students, their writing behavior. And that includes things like goal setting, self-assessment, self-reinforcement, and for younger kids, self-talk or self-instruction. And I think the easiest way to demonstrate this is to kind of give an example of a strategy. I also should say that this uses a gradual release model, which I'll say a little bit about in a second. So the gradual release model, the basic idea is that basically we model the strategies for students. So if we're going to do something like, you know, brainstorming and we're working with kindergarten or first grade kids, I might model how to brainstorm while thinking out loud, um, ideas for something that we as a class are going to write together, say kindergarten or first grade. And students would help me so that as I'm modeling, I'm talking out loud so students can see the strategy and can also see the thinking that goes on with it. And the reason for engaging them in that is that if all you're doing is modeling, kids are going to tune you out. And especially if it's a more complex strategy. Now, typically in self-regulated strategy development, what we do before this modeling thing is we might talk with kids about, what they do now, and we might point out nobody seems to take any time to plan and generate ideas before they write. And what I want to do is introduce you to a strategy that will get, kind of the juices going for thinking about ideas for what you're going to write about. And it's called brainstorming, and you probably already know how to do this, but we'll talk about its advantages and discuss it, and then I will model it. And so usually what we do is we'll introduce background knowledge. We'll make sure kids have the knowledge they need to know to use the strategy successfully. And you'll see this in a second. And we discuss with them what the strategy can do with you. And often we talk about when and where you can use it. And then really the heart of all of this is practice. And so typically what we do is we have students practice together. Once we feel from the modeling that they've got the handle on it, they'll do it together with whatever support materials done. And we start fading that out to them doing it independently. And the reflect is kind of put to the side over here to go back around. But reflection can take place at any point. But we always talk with students about how we can make this a better strategy and what we can do. And so let me get a little bit more specific here. I'm going to introduce you to 3 strategies. We've used this with second and third grade students. There's been some people that have used the couple of strategies I'm going to introduce with you all the way up into middle school and with English foreign language students in other countries. So you have PAL, which is what I would call part of the writing process. So in this particular case, what we did is we only focused in on, basically the PAL part, picking my idea. So that's what I'm going to write about, making a decision about what my writing topic's going to be, assuming that it's not being assigned, planning by organizing my notes. And we're going to use something called tree to do that in a second, and then write and say more. And so that is a reminder to kids that even if you have a plan and you start writing, good writers keep planning as they write. It's not like you get a plan and that's it, you're stuck with it. You keep thinking and keep modifying to make your paper meet your intentions and your goals as you do this. And we point out that POW or power with an RE, which would be revise and edit, can be used with any type of writing, and it gives students power when they write. So, it's just basically a small reminder of the processes we go through. And in this particular case, we've kind of suspended revision for a little bit in terms of teaching this. The tree strategy basically is for a simple opinion essay. And basically what we have students do before they write is they need to make a decision about what stance they're going to take, what their premise is going to be. And we have them brainstorm or generate reasons. And the reason part can be, the whole class generating reasons to support that premise. It could be kids working together. It could be looking at source material. You can approach it in different ways. And then once they've generated their reason, what we want them to do is pick at least 3, but more if it works for them. They're strong reasons, but we ask them to evaluate those reasons. Why do I believe this? Will my readers believe this? And then we want to make sure as they take their notes, they say more about each of the reasons and they'll do that as they write. And then we have them take some notes on their ending and wrapping it up. And this is kind of illustrated. They start with a graphic organizer in which they can record in note form. We really stress this because what happens if kids write it out in full sentences, then they complain when, all they do is copy it off of there with a few changes. The end point of this instruction, though, is not to give them the graphic organizer, but they create their own graphic organizer that they use because we're not going to be there with them all the time. Now, as we're working through this, we're also, because of the type of writing we're doing, working on other things as well. And so we generate, we share with them a list of linking words and we look at other compositions to see how they're used, but we have them generate, and you can see where kids have written on here linking words of their own. And we talk about how to get this going in terms of attention getters at the start of your opinion essay and how to wrap it up right. So you'll see some of the things on it. Now, when we work with source material, then what we have tended to do is use a strategy called TWA, think before, while, and after writing. And basically what this does, and you'll see this in a little bit more clear in a second, it's getting them to read source material. In this case, with second or third grade kids, it's often one piece of source material or two at the most, but they're looking for information that they would like to use to support their premise. If they were using a more sophisticated strategy to make a decision about the premise that they're going to use, and then they'd be looking for ideas to support that premise and ideas on the other side that they're going to reject. But this will give you an idea. This is an example of informational text, and this is at the 4th or 5th grade level. And so this is bumped up a little bit to older kids. And this particular text we were using with kids with special needs, with learning disabilities at the 4th and 5th grade level. And then you can kind of see what this all looks like towards the end. The kids go through, they're reading through this, they underline things that they think might be important for the premise that they're going to put forward. They label them, they star them, then they, generate. And this kid wrote PAL at the top to remind him, and he has TWA. He's checking off what he did over here, and you can see that he's checking off tree. Now, we didn't teach this kid to do that. This kid did that on his own, and you can see his notes, and then this is his essay, but that's kind of what the endpoint looks like. So the other thing that we do with SRSD is goal setting. Kids set goals to use the things that they're learning in other situations and with other writing things, and also, to make sure that their papers have the elements that they're working on. But one of the things that the practice guide also pointed out is that when teachers set clear writing goals for their students, then their writing is likely to improve. Basically, if you tell people what you want, you're more likely to get it. It's as simple as that. This probably, for the amount of time that it takes, is the easiest thing that you can do, is being clear on what you want. Now, there's a downside to that, right? And that is, if you say to kids, I would like for your essay to deal with, have 3 supporting reasons, for a lot of kids, that's all you're going to get. So, what we tend to do is we tend to set goals slightly higher than what we typically see from them, or encourage them to set goals and to monitor how that's going, so that it's pushing that envelope out a little bit. But these would be 2 examples of goals that we might use. So those 4th grade kids in the POW tree and TWA study, the strategy is not aimed at dealing with both sides of an argument. Usually that's around 4th grade, 5th or 6th grade that we start doing that with kids. But you can give kids a goal to refute 2 ideas on the other side, or supporting ideas on the other side. And typically kids can do that without, in 4th or 5th grade, without any instruction. What they're not doing is they don't often realize that that's what they're supposed to be doing, is that a good argument addresses both sides or multiple sides of an issue. Or let's say that you're working with kids in third grade and they use what I call the thesaurus approach for revising, which is they, clean up a spelling miscue here, they change a couple of words there, but there's not much in substantive changes. So you might have a goal to add 3 new ideas to your paper, or something we did in one study where we were working on story writing. We asked kids to, we give them a choice of these goals and they would pick which one they wanted to use, but they might add a new character or change the time in which the story took place or the setting. Now, that worked pretty well, and kids internalize that idea of having more substantive stuff in. But I have to tell you, out of every, say, 12 kids, 2 of the kids would always beat us at this. Like you'd get a kid who would say, oh, and by the way, when they revise their paper, at the end of the paper, they say, oh, by the way, Johnny was a character in the story. So, even the best laid plans don't always go as we'd like, and that's a reason why we want to monitor. So the third recommendation is teach students to become fluent with handwriting, spelling, sentence construction, typing, and word processing. And the evidence is good here. It's moderate. And I'm going to add a little bit to this. First, I'd like to say why this is important. So I want you to think about being a 4th grade kid who is not too good at spelling. So my daughter, when she was in 4th grade, couldn't spell Here correctly. Spelling was her nemesis, the demon that she dealt with anytime that she wrote. And what that meant for her is that when she was a smart kid and ideas would come quickly, but if every 4th word you don't know how to spell, you kind of like, you're in the zone or you're in hyperspace, and every 4th word you got to drop out of there. And you have to think about how to spell that word. And then, you try to get back in again, and you got to stop and think about how to spell that word 4 or 5 words later. And so one of the things that happens is you're trying to hold ideas in working memory as you take them and transform them into, or translate those into, acceptable English in terms of, the sentence that you're going to produce that meets your intentions and that makes sense grammatically. And you're writing down the words where, at the same time you're engaged in handwriting. So there's a lot going on here, and you've got to stop. And so the idea you're holding in working memory has a tendency to slip away, or the idea for the next thing you're going to say if it's being held in working memory. So what we see with kids with spelling or handwriting, because they're often not fast enough to keep up with, their thoughts, ideas slip away like that. We see writing that is impoverished in terms of ideation. It's not that these kids don't have more to say. And we also see kids who the quality of their writing is not as good either. And the reason for that is some of the plans for what they're going to say next slip away as well. And so you get a little bit more disjointed writing. You get writing that doesn't have a lot of ideation in it. And these kids often stop before they're done. Now, why do I say that? We did a study where we prompted kids after they had written an essay, essentially we're done. We said, we know this is a little difficult, but I want you to say more. And we did it again, and we did it again. And, basically, we doubled to tripled the amount of information the kids produced. And about 60 to 70% of that information was new. So it wasn't that they didn't have something to say. These transcription skills get in the way of that. And so we want to be sure that they become, with handwriting, automatic, and you don't have to think about it. And same thing with typing. And we want spelling not to be this dropping out of hyperspace every 4th word. Now, if you want to get a feel for this for yourself, after we're done today, take your non-dominant hand and write for 10 minutes. It may only last 5, but every 4th word, spell it backwards and see what you think about writing at that point. Now, there's some other good news here. When we teach kids handwriting, when we teach kids spelling, when we teach kids typing, they get better at those skills. But there's also other effects as well. For handwriting and spelling, We typically get longer texts from kids, and as they start mastering these and automatizing them, and writing quality improves as well. Spelling is like a triple threat because one of the things that we found recently in a meta-analysis we did is decoding skills become stronger in reading, and there's improvement in reading comprehension, likely through that improvement in decoding. Word fluency was close to being statistically significant. It was had a positive effect. I just don't think there were enough studies to take it to statistical significance. But these skills are really important, and we've gone through a period where they've been ignored in terms of writing instruction. Now, what I'm not suggesting to you is that what we want to do is make our programs just this. When I was a kid, this is what we were taught in school. We didn't write. This and sentence construction is pretty much all we did. Um, Sentence construction was also part of this, and this is probably the most effective procedure for sentence construction. It's called sentence combining. It's one of the few things that I ever talk about that was not developed by teachers, was not developed in the classroom by current or former teachers. And this was developed by linguists, and they were looking at the structure of language, and somebody had the bright idea, what if we modeled for kids how to put smaller sentences together into more complex ones? And by modeling, what we're saying here is you might have these two sentences written on the board, and the but means that you have to use that word when you put these sentences together. But I would think out loud as I put this sentence together, and I might do it two ways. Jill wanted to go swimming, but Alfonso wanted to play baseball. And I might also show that we could do it the other way. And then the kids and I in my classroom, we've done several studies using this approach. What we would do is together, I would kind of lead in the modeling, but they would start taking over. And then I'd have them do something like this. And then I'd have them go back to their writing to look for places where they can apply the skill that they're learning using but. Now, one thing to notice here, there's no grammar that you have to talk about in this. Now, that doesn't mean you can't, but this has been effective and improved grammar, sentence construction, and writing quality without it. The fourth recommendation was a recommendation that basically we all felt was very important. And I'll say a little bit about this in a second. I've done some work looking at what exceptional teachers in literacy do in their classroom. What are some of the commonalities or themes that you see? And what you see is that they create an engaged community of writers or a community of writers or a classroom where students can take risk and are motivated. And so what are some of the things that we thought as a group was important? And these are also things in this kind of meta synthesis that we did of qualitative studies of exceptional children that we found, is that teachers are members of their writing community, their classroom. They're writers. They write, they share their writing, they talk about writing, they make it clear that writing is important. So they're not just a teacher, they're a writer within that community. And I think that's particularly important, something that the National Writing Project does a really good job of emphasizing. The next thing I always hesitate a little bit on, they also gave students writing choice. Now, we've done some studies looking at choice, and everybody likes choice, but we're not seeing a lot of evidence in writing that just putting choice into play makes much of a difference. But there's multiple ways of kind of approaching choice, and there's only about 13 studies in writing looking at this. And one of the things is we want to be sure, I think, that occasionally we give students choice about the topics they write about, but we also want to give students some choice in making modifications to the topics we assign. So, if a kid comes up to us and says, I've got a really good idea for something I'd like to do with this that's a little different, my response would be go for it. And so, choice doesn't have to be just the writing topic, on what topic we write about, but it can be aspects of what we do when we're writing. Something that we want to be sure that we do is praise students' efforts and accomplishments. This is particularly the case when we're talking about kids who are struggling writers or kids with special needs. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that you praise non-accomplishments. Kids recognize the BS meter quite quickly. But with young kids, we can often, both in private and, even more publicly, I wouldn't do this publicly with middle school or high school kids, make it clear what they're doing well. And letting them know why we thought it was done well. We want kids to write for real purposes as much as possible. Kind of a Maryland story. When my daughter went to a Quaker school in College Park, and when they were in fifth grade, her class decided that they would save the Chesapeake Bay, which is a common thing amongst Delaware, Virginia, DC, and Maryland students. And they decided they'd do that by cleaning up a spring that ran through the University of Maryland and behind the school that they attended. Now, it doesn't sound like it has anything to do with writing, but they wrote 2 grants that they submitted to the College Park government. They wrote a letter that they submitted to the Washington Post. It wasn't published. A letter for the College Park paper, which was a letter for the University of Maryland paper, an editorial which was published. They held a rally where they did their signs. They wrote letters that they put in mailboxes. And basically, the teacher just had to get out of the way. The kids didn't even think of this as writing. They were doing something that they saw as important and for a real purpose. And the more of that we can do with kids, the more likely they're not only going to grow as writers, but they're going to like to write. One of the things that we thought was important is that writing needs to be visible and an important part of the writing community. We want students to work together, and we want to give and receive feedback. Now, I'd like to say something about feedback. Peer feedback can be successful, self-feedback can be successful, and teacher feedback can be successful. But I think a couple of things these quotes kind of point out. Feedback like rain should be gentle enough to nourish a person's growth without destroying the roots. When we give feedback, we want to be sure we tell kids what they did right. Let them know what we liked. Feedback does help. This is something that a kid said. Feedback does not help me because I don't know how I'm wrong. So sometimes we write, this is unclear here. Well, that may be clear to you, but it's not clear to the kid, because if it was clear, they wouldn't have written something that was unclear, most likely. And so we want to be sure that our feedback is constructive, criteria-based, specific. And in some instances, kids may need instruction or teaching to be able to carry out the feedback that we give them. That seems to be a lost part of the feedback loop. Too much feedback can paralyze me and reinforce that I'm a poor writer. And so, one thing I think this is particularly true for young kids and even for those of us who are old writers, we hate when we get something that looks like it's had a knife that's bleeding blood, on every page with the red ink. So, one of the things, it's too time consuming. And so we limit how much students write because we don't want to give feedback. And second, it's too much for kids to deal with. My recommendation is that you pick 3 or 4 things that you want to give feedback on and stick to that. It's not like every paper has to be perfect. We have time across the year to help students grow if we're systematic in giving our feedback. You said nothing about what I made better. I did a workshop in Texas with 500 teachers on giving feedback, and the first thing we did is we looked at a paper written by a kid with learning disabilities in about 5th grade. And, they worked together in small groups to give feedback on it. We talked about it. They had great ideas on it. We did something else. And a little bit later, I asked them to look at a paper written a week later by the same kid. And they got back in their groups. They did feedback, etc. A lot of good suggestions again. Only 2 teachers out of 500 connected the first writing sample with the second one. It's hard when we have a class of 20, 25, 30 students, but we want to be sure that we reinforce what students, if we said in the last one, here's something you need to work on, and we see that they've done that in the next composition, we want to reinforce that. Or if we see the same problem again, we might be thinking about putting some instruction in play. And then we want to think about feedback as a two-way street. You know, this is something that a student said to me once when I gave him feedback. Do you care what I think? And you know, he was right, because I was a one-way person on this. I was saying, this is, you know, here's what you need to do. And quite honestly, it's not the way that a professional writes. You know, I get feedback on everything that I do, but I don't always do everything that reviewers say. I have to think about my intentions, my goals, and whether or not the reviewer was right. And I think we want students to have ownership of their writing, and we want them to learn to also be active decision makers, that this is not a one-way street. It's a highway you go down multiple ways. So a couple of more recent updates in research from meta-analysis we've done. You know, maybe this isn't a surprise. This actually comes from single participant design research, but if we teach students for strategies for writing paragraphs, you know, how to have a lead-in sentence, how to have sentences towards the end that either kind of leads you out to the next paragraph or sum up or not, that helps students become better writers. And that can be done explicitly and directly, you know, through something like a strategy instruction. I've also seen it done where you take paragraphs that are pretty good, take each sentence, put them on a strip, mix them up, and then have kids decide which order to put them in, and then compare back to the model. Engaging students in pre-writing activities, you know, like reading before they write, graphic organizers help them generate information and organize it, are effective as well. That didn't show up in the What Works Clearinghouse approach. We're collecting more and more information showing a couple of things on connecting reading and writing. When students write, their write more, their reading comprehension gets better. When they write about what they read, they understand the material better. When we teach skills like sentence combining or sentence construction and spelling, reading fluency gets better through the sentence work. And as I mentioned before with spelling, we get improved decoding and comprehension. And when we teach process and, you know, basic ideas surrounding text, you know, the structural elements and their purposes, we get improvements in reading comprehension. And it goes the other way. It goes back the other way. We also know that if you have programs where 60 to 40% are spent on writing or reading, or reading or writing, students get better at both reading and writing, better than they would when we have unbalanced programs. We also know that using writing as a tool for learning, when you write about material in content areas like science, social studies, and math, students understand that material better and remember it better. And I kind of already said that when we directly teach students what the purposes of different types of genres are, like argumentative writing, and the basic building blocks of those, like you have a premise, you know, you have reasons that to support that premise, you provide evidence and elaboration on that, you address counter reasons. When they are familiar with that and are taught how to use it in their own writing, their writing quality improves. And you know, it used to be, I'd say, word processing programs, by having kids write on word processors makes you a better writer. This last meta-analysis we're doing, it doesn't have much of an effect anymore. I think it's too familiar of a tool. But word processing plus programs where you might have something like inspiration, a planning program that students can turn to help them think about what they're going to do, or it has an automatic writing evaluation system in it that gives them feedback, or it sets up a context, you know, like a game-like feature, or has game-like features. Those tools are becoming more and more effective. Now, I said I want to leave a little time for question, but I wanted to come to the boogeyman in the room, artificial intelligence. So you'll see that that's in red. We've been doing a number of studies looking at various aspects of artificial intelligence. One is giving feedback, another is scoring writing, and another set is taking a look at teachers' and students' opinions about AI and how they're shifting over time. But I want to put this in the context of the 4 recommendations. So one of the things that we said is right. And so I'm going to go to another page. So this has been the area that's caused the most consternation around AI is that AI now can write reasonably like a human, and writing's going to disappear. So first, let me assure you that writing's not going to disappear. There are some aspects of writing I think that probably will, and we're already seeing, in the world of work, um, some of these things being done less. But, writing is a powerful tool for healing. And when we write about psychological and physical issues we are experiencing, that can serve a powerful healing purpose. No machine's going to be able to do that for us. We use writing to connect with family and friends. Now, of course, you can have AI write an email to send to a family and friends, but it doesn't really connect you with them in any meaningful way. And so while it can do that for you, it basically takes you out of the system. And I don't think that's going to be satisfying for a lot of people. We use writing to explore who we are and where we've been, like when we write diaries. And again, that's not something AI can do for us. We write about the information we are to learn. Now, we can have AI write for us in terms of, a report or a short essay on something we're learning. But the problem is that the power of writing there is actually engaging in it. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And so that's an area that I think we need to really think carefully about, because if you have AI write for you, then what happens is you don't learn much. And there's starting to be studies to show that. And we write to show what we know. And again, AI can write something for you, but it doesn't serve a very strong purpose in terms of assessment about what we know. Let me go back a little bit. So we want to think about what it is we use this for. And in a sense, what I'm saying is we want to put some guardrails around this. We can also use AI to help us in terms of the process of writing. And that's one of the places where we're seeing a lot of exploration going on now, is people will you know, uh, have kids play with AI as they write. And most of the play seems to be around having AI help generate topics to write about, help generate ideas to write about, and with some help around organization. And those are areas which I think, kids will use AI in the future, but they need to learn how to use those in a strategic and ethical way. For some kids, who have severe difficulty establishing foundational writing skills, you can have AI take ideas that you've generated and turn them into acceptable sentences. Now, you still have to look at those, but you can see where that may be a compensation strategy that we want to use. The engaged community part's a bit more difficult because I, I envision that what will eventually happen here is that we're likely going to be using AI in writing communities, whether they're classrooms or other ones, and people will work together with machines to write. But again, we have to think about what we're doing there. So let me switch ahead just a second and tell you what my guardrails are for me. What I think makes most sense. We just published a white paper for this for the Wright Center, which I was a PI on, for secondary writing funded by the Institute of Educational Sciences. We want to ensure that AI remains a tool that we use, not a tool that takes the place of thinking. And so let me give an example of this. So let's say that we write something. We can prompt AI to give us a schematic view of how the content's organized. And we could then analyze that organization to decide, it's a little bit more abstract without reading through the whole thing, to look to see if there's places where we have something that doesn't fit, something that needs to be moved, something that's missing. Now, AI hasn't done any thinking for us there, but it's increased the amount of thinking that we actually do. And so I think that's particularly important, is we want to be sure that we keep thinking as much as we can. I'm not saying that there's not going to be times where we don't limit some of the thinking that could take place. For example, if I generate a series of ideas and those are turned into sentences, well, thinking about what you're going to say occurs during those sentences. But if we're smart, we then go look at those sentences to see if they say what we want to say, if there's more that we want to say. So we reduce thinking a little bit. We've gained something in terms of the mechanical part, and we're having to learn a new skill in terms of, analyzing what this machine puts out, because not everything's going to be perfect, and making decisions on that. In some ways, I actually think the use of AI is going to require more skills rather than less. And then finally, we want to be sure that it doesn't minimize learning and that students grow as writers. And so by learning, what I mean is, if you think about when you write about something you're reading or something that occurs in a science class, you have to make decisions about what's important. You have to usually organize those ideas. You have to put them in your own words, which means handling them. You have to form a personal bond with them because you have a particular goal to do something. All of those things facilitate learning. You see the material again as you write. So that's a really powerful facilitator of learning. And often as you're engaged in this, you're connecting old and new ideas, your old ideas in your head with the new ideas there. And that's why we have to be very careful about having AI serve as our tool for thinking about the content we're learning. And we want to be sure that students grow as writers. I gave the example where, it generates sentences. That doesn't relieve us from the responsibility of making sure whatever those sentences are make sense, that they intend what we need to say. It's really going to require that we learn some new skills if we're going to make this work. I guess maybe on the other end, you could look at this and say, we don't really have a lot of choice. The genie's out of the bottle and it's not going to go back in. So we have a little time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Graham. I'm Rachel, for anybody that doesn't know me, with TRLMD. And I have been, the chat has been amazing, lots of really great conversations. So we manage time, we do have about 7 questions that I was hoping we could get to. If we don't, though, maybe we can kind of address them in the next session. So I don't.
That would be fine, yeah.
Yep. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a couple of things. First off, there was a question about if there's plans to update the practice guides. It seems like with the political climate that's probably not so much, but any thoughts?
I don't think it's going to happen. If you look at, if you go on their website, it actually looks like some of these have been updated. All they've done is they've said revised and put a new date on them. I'm not sure whose idea that was. So that happened with the elementary one and the secondary guide as well. I don't think with the current administration, given their attacks, on education and science in general, that we're going to see this in the future. And it's unfortunate because I think, it's probably the most stringent look at what we can say about what works that exists, not just in the US, in the world.
All right. We had a question too that related to your research, that you've shown that spending more time writing doesn't improve those writing skills. So the participant was looking about how can that be revised or worked with? Is there more impactful recommendations that we should think about and a way to revise that revision? I know that to add in my 2 cents, you talk that fluency is important. I know that increased practice helps with fluency. Is there a way to revise or change that recommendation, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think you brought up a really good point here. So, like when we're learning spelling skills or sentence construction skills or handwriting, or how to plan, basically what writing does is it gives us a place to put those into action. And like you said, something like handwriting fluency, when you're in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, you gain about 10 letters per minute a year. You don't gain that through instruction. You gain that mainly through actually writing. Handwriting instruction typically is gone after 2nd grade, but kids keep getting faster. My response to this is that what we need to do is we need to have kids write, but we support them as they write. So things like feedback, you know, pre-writing activities where they gather information and they think about what they're going to do, making sure they have the kinds of strategies that they can use beforehand that they put in place for planning or revising or peers working together. So those things support you as you write. The problem with like the Norwegian study that I mentioned is that all the kids were doing was writing. You know, they seem to really enjoy it, but it wasn't enough to push them forward, because when you're supporting students through things like graphic organizer or feedback, they start to internalize some of that information or skills or processes that you're showing them. And so in a sense, that helps drive them along to have the skills to be better writers and the strategies to be better writers. So I think that support along with writing and teaching that, you know, provides students with independent skills and strategies that they can use to write better. That's the key to that. And, you know, part of the problem sometimes is we're reductionists and we separate these things out as they fit in different groups. But those three things go together to me.
For sure. We had a question about kindergarten writing. She says that I've been using, I think, SRSD trained, and I've read The Writing Revolution, just purchased The Writing Rope, haven't read it yet. Are there any resources that explicitly teach how to teach kindergarten students writing? And then she goes on to talk about some other programs about kid writing and wondering if that's evidence-based. But so kindergarten explicit teaching.
Quite honestly, we don't know a lot from an evidence-based perspective about teaching writing at the kindergarten level. There's very, very few studies that are actually out there. But I think instead of recommending a program or something, I'd recommend a person that you might be interested. It's Hope Gerde, Gerde, who's at Texas A&M. Her and her collaborators, I really consider to be on the very cutting edge of what's happening with young kids. So that would be somebody whose work I would take a look at and would, you know, if I have a question, that's who I go to.
Great. So question about spelling. How can we get students to be better at spelling? This viewer has students that seem to be unable to remember words and to spell words correctly. Families are working with them. This is a second grader, but thoughts on improving spelling?
Yeah, so you know, this is a bit of a struggle. Let me give you my, I'm going to say something, but let me also provide my email address. And for the person who asked this, please email me and I'll send you something of a program that we use with first and second grade kids. That was quite effective with kids who were struggling readers, writers, and also had, in some instances, language difficulties. And it's Steve, S-T-E-V-E, Graham, Graham, at asu.edu. So in this study, what we did was we had 3 lessons a week, 20 minutes long. And we would have 2 or 3 spelling patterns that were pretty consistent that we would emphasize. So it could be something as, you know, like short CVC versus CVCE. And it might just have, you know, just be with the A vowel sounds. Or it might be, you know, a CVC, but, you know, with different vowels. Or, you know, it could be CK at the end of the words and words that fit with that. But each week we would do a word sort where we would take a word like mad, and we would say it, and we'd say add, and we'd put it up on the board, and then we might have made, and we'd aid, and put it up on the board, and I say, now I have some other cards, and I'm going to think out loud about where they go, and they would be words that fit 1 or 2 of those patterns. And what I'd start doing is involving kids in terms of helping me think through what the underlying rule is. What we typically do is we tell kids a rule, and then, you know, they don't seem to ever remember it. So what our approach has been is we engage them in developing the rule with us through word sorts. And sometimes they don't get the rule. In that case, we tell it to them. The other thing is that we work on about 8 or 10 words that week that they don't know that fit that rule that they've missed in, a pre-spelling test. And it's fairly traditional on that, but they're typical words that kids might use in their writing at that grade. And we know that because we looked at 10 million words. It's probably the last time we'll ever do anything like that. We also do word building activities, and this can be very helpful I did this with my daughter in second grade when she was having so much. So something like mad, AD, you have that rhyme at the end, and you can take AD and build a lot of words with it, right? By adding in consonants or consonant clusters or diagraphs. And same thing with ADE. And so that's also part of it. And we have kids hunt for words that fit those patterns. In their reading and stuff. And teachers would build walls with words that kids, build a tree on their walls with words that kids came in with. And so that worked pretty well with us. We were able to bring kids who were at the 25th or 20 or below 25th percentile on norm reference spelling test up close to being at the 50th percentile over the course of, about 3 to 4 or 5 months. But, it was pretty intensive and we worked 2-on-2. Now that's a little harder to do in a classroom, but we've also done this in a classroom as well, and it's worked pretty well. So please email me and I'll send you something on that. And that's one of my favorite programs, partially because I work some of it out with my daughter.
Great. Many schools have applied this idea of daily time to write as like a writing block. Kids do need periods of extended writing time, or you limit the types of writing. But can you speak to how this could look different across the day?
Yeah. So one of the things, and I'm struggling with this now, I'm working with a commercial material company who's a basal reader, and they're trying to integrate more writing in. And there's no way they're going to balance, you're going to get as much time for writing as you get for reading. It's just not going to happen. This has been the struggle I feel like I've faced forever. So we're looking at places where we can bring writing in as a tool for facilitating reading. And that would include things like summary writing or, opinions about different things in text. But at the same time, students are working on a bigger project that cuts across a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, so that writing occurs throughout the program, but there's a time for extended writing that is genre based, like working on a long story or working on, a detailed opinion that you want to put forward or something that, an informational text. And that could be done in a week, but it might be done over 2 or 3 weeks so that, it ends up looking more like a unit that you're working on. Now, with something like SRSD, if you were to bring it in, then you would be working typically on smaller things because you want students to practice that. But that's kind of the approach I've taken because I've been stymied at every turn in terms of getting more in.
Great. I'm wondering if we can fit one more in. Well,
Yeah.
there's a little bit of a related one. Somebody was asking about that recommendation for the hour of writing time. That's okay to break that up like in bits and pieces throughout the day? Okay.
Yeah, but I do want to emphasize something here. I was serious about the 30 minutes on instruction. So we've done some national surveys where we've asked primary grade teachers, randomly selected, and intermediate grade teachers, randomly selected from throughout the US, about their writing instruction. And, the game when you do these surveys. Nobody wants to say they're not doing something. But when we ask about amount of time, we were finding about 25 minutes of instructional time for writing in the primary grades. When we did this with intermediate grade teachers, it dropped to 15 minutes. It was almost like the amount of time writing stayed about the same, but the instructional time got less. And one way you could interpret that is that, we don't need to teach writing anymore. But any fourth grade kid, they're a long ways from being where they eventually will be, when they're in middle school, high school, or as an adult. And so I want to really stress that it's important that we, do our due diligence in the trenches on the instructional part.
Great, thank you so much. We do have two more questions, but I think that it might be best not to rush you, and maybe we leave those for our next week. But I want to thank everybody in the chat for your participation. Everybody was engaged in kind of listening and then reading and kind of multitasking. But I'm going to pass it over to Susan real quick to close us out. And thank you so much, Dr. Graham.
And I'm going to say goodbye because I'm headed for something called the Canal Convergence in Scottsdale. So you guys have a good night.
All right. Thank you again, Dr. Graham. We appreciate you and your time this evening. We are excited about continuing this next week. It's November 19th, not the 18th. Sorry about that typo. Thank you again for joining us. Here is our all of our information about connecting with us. We want to express our deep gratitude and appreciation to Keys Literacy, who through their sponsorship, we were able to provide this evening's presentation for free for everyone who came this evening. We're looking forward to seeing lots of you next week. Have a great evening and have a good rest of your week. Thanks for coming.